For the first time in decades, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestinians both in the occupied territories and those living in Israel are taking part in protests and a general strike. They are calling it a day of rage. This was Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank just a short time ago, where there have been confrontations between Israeli security forces and Palestinian protesters. Israeli security forces are using live ammunition there. At least 12 Palestinians have been injured. We are also hearing reports of Israeli snipers in the area. Similar scenes near Ramallah as well, where there have been armed confrontations between some protesters and Israeli security forces. Those are still ongoing, though they have calmed down a little bit. There have also been tense scenes in Nablus in the occupied West Bank, where demonstrators have been facing off with Israeli security forces. One Palestinian protester was killed and more than 160 others injured during demonstrations across the West Bank. 2 Israeli soldiers have also been wounded. And earlier, this was the scene near Damascus Gate in the occupied East Jerusalem. Protesters there heeded calls for demonstrations, but were met with an Israeli crackdown. A photojournalist was targeted, and many protesters were beaten. Let's go first to Al Jazeera correspondent Nida Ibrahim. She was reporting live to us near Ramallah when those shots were fired. She was talking to my colleague Hala Mahidin.
To talk more about what brings these protesters here, we're joined now by a Palestinian who was at the protest, Layali Hamail. You have been living here, you were born and raised under occupation. What makes you think that protests...
Nida.
We're seeing crowds are leaving. We're not sure what's going on. There are people, Palestinians, who are standing.
Okay, Nida, can you get down and get to a place of safety, please?
Yes, we are ducking now because it seems like there are bullets.
Okay, Nida, we're gonna let you get to a place of safety because it sounds rather dangerous where you're reporting from. Nida Ibrahim, we're going to check in with you and come back to you later on.
Let's go to Nida Ibrahim. She's live for us now. Nida, that was very dramatic, that footage there taking place live on air. Talk us through exactly what happened, and were any people injured as a result of it?
We were here reporting from a hill overlooking the confrontations here near the illegal Israeli settlement of Beit El. When we heard gunshots and people leaving, we believe that those were Palestinian militants shooting towards the Israeli army that is near the illegal settlement of Beit El, that has been already firing at the Palestinian protesters at the scene. Now, later on, the confrontations intensified and the Palestinians have been leaving the scene. We're seeing many less numbers than the ones we've been seeing since the protest started. When the protest started, we were talking about the largest protest that we've been seeing since the start of the escalation last Monday. But now more Palestinians are returning to the scene, and we hear every now and then sounds of shots from the Israeli forces, and then we hear the ambulances taking those wounded to the hospital. Now, as a result of that exchange of fire, we weren't able to identify how many Palestinians were shot at by that certain exchange of fire. But all in all, Palestinian medical sources talk about several hundred Palestinians who have been injured all over the occupied West Bank, and confrontations going on in different cities as well. But they say that 63 of these injuries were here in Ramallah, were transferred to hospitals in the city, and that more than half of those were hit by live ammunition.
And Nida, do we have a sense of how things are going to develop now? Because the day started off, as you were describing, with many thousands of people coming out, including families with children. Then the scene turned violent. It is heading towards evening now where you are. Do we have an understanding at all of how things are going to develop?
Well, this scene of exchange of fire is something that is not usual in these protests. We see them every few years, potentially happening in different military, happening near military checkpoints. But it's not something that we can say it happens regularly. It's hard for us to predict what's going to happen once the sun sets. Usually when the sun sets, it becomes dark and the surroundings here become very dangerous. It's hard to know where the Israeli army is coming from or whether, if more militants are going to arrive at the scene. It's very unlikely since the West Bank is not known for its weapons, and usually the Israeli army, when they receive information about people who are carrying arms, they go in and arrest them and take them. So it's hard to predict how the day is going to be heading when it comes to those firing or militant Palestinians. But when it comes to those protesters, I can tell you that many of them are still here. They're refusing to go, but the numbers are much less than the ones we've seen since the protest started here near the illegal Israeli settlement of Beit El.
Nida Ibrahim there for us in Ramallah. Many thanks. Let's take you now to Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank. Our correspondent Harry Fawcett is live there. Harry, many dramatic scenes where you were earlier today. We were seeing all kinds of tactics being used by the Israelis. Talk us through what happened where you are.
Sure. Well, I mean, just right now, a couple more stones have just landed sort of near our feet here. You can see the protesters are really quite a long way pushed back in the distance, but the pattern has been that they will gradually approach this Israeli border police or military area. What we also heard just before we came on air was a large volley of tear gas to this side of the camera, which is to the west, where we know that the Aida refugee camp is. So it seems that a lot of the concentration of the action has now moved from this street to that refugee camp. Earlier, though, as you say, yes, this was the focal point of many encounters and injuries sustained on the Palestinian side between the Palestinian protesters and the Israeli military here. What we've seen is them approaching, throwing stones. Initially, when the larger body of the protest headed up this road, there was an immediate dispersal of them by a very large round of tear gas. And since then, it's been these sort of running skirmishes where people will approach, throw stones, and then the Israelis will do one of a number of things. They've been out surprising them from hidden areas in houses nearby, grabbing one of them violently and taking them away. They've been using the tear gas and skunk water to drive them away. They usually involving troops coming out and confronting in one way or another. But in the most recent such episode, nobody came out from the outpost here behind us. It was simply the use of sniper fire. We saw one man fall down, injured by that live bullet, and the street was dispersed pretty quickly as people ran into the alleyways and further up the street away. We know that there have been at least 12 injuries here by Israeli live fire, another 11 at least hit by rubber-coated steel bullets, one of those at least a puncture wound from that weaponry. There's also, as I say, been skunk water, this very toxic, very putrid, chemically laced water being used, and stun grenades and tear gas very, very heavily. So dozens of people also injured in terms of the effects of that tear gas.
Yeah, Harry, I was actually going to ask you for you to describe what skunk water is. We can't assume that people watching know what that is. Do you get a sense, at least from what you're describing, that quite heavy-handed tactics are being used there by the Israeli military to bring that protest to an end?
To say the very least, it's extremely heavy-handed. I mean, we're talking about stones and rocks and children's marbles just a few centimeters in diameter being thrown against a wall of concrete and steel, behind which the Israeli troops are stationed. And in return, the amount of firepower we've seen on display just in this isolated protest on this particular few hours of one afternoon is pretty extraordinary. Not least, of course, in fact, the most dangerous and lethal of all of that is the live fire that we've been seeing used. We've seen snipers shooting people who have been using slingshots and their own bare hands to throw objects at this very heavily protected, very heavily armed First World Army. And so, yes, that is how things play out here. It's how things are playing out right now. No deaths that we have reported here so far, but there have been elsewhere. There was, as Nida was reporting, an exchange of fire further north, further south. The day began with an attempted, according to the Israelis, an attempted attack at a checkpoint outside Hebron, where the Israeli army says they were approached by a Palestinian who was carrying a homemade gun, a knife, and some kind of explosive device, and that he was shot and, in their terms, neutralized. That means he's been killed.
OK, many thanks for that. Harry Fawcett there for us in Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank. As Harry was saying, those protesters moved quite far back down that street. We can't really see them very clearly, but they are still there. Let's take you to southern Israel, and our correspondent Imran Khan is live there for us. So tell us exactly why you are where you are. Earlier you were talking about how that particular position might have brought some hope to the people in Gaza who are suffering a very tough humanitarian situation.
That's absolutely right. The reason I'm here today was there was some sort of hope, particularly from the aid agencies, that Kerem Abu Salem, a crossing through the Gaza barrier into Gaza, was going to open for a humanitarian convoy carrying much-needed aid to get into Gaza. The United Nations collecting aid from various different aid agencies, including Médecins Sans Frontières, the World Health Organization, and others, drove their trucks early in the morning down to the crossing. It's only a few kilometers that way, and they were hopeful that they would be able to cross. Then a number of incidents happened throughout the day. Firstly, there was real confusion in the morning as to whether the Israeli army would allow them to cross. In the very early hours, they said, no, it's not going to happen. We're not going to let you cross. Then the Israeli army released another statement saying, actually, we're in discussions. Hopefully, all the parties will agree and we can get the crossing open. I'm paraphrasing there, clearly. However, it didn't happen. It didn't happen for a few hours. As we were stood here, we saw 3 Jordanian army-donated mobile field hospitals, absolutely crucial given what's going on in Gaza, come in. They didn't even get to Kerem Abu Salem, the crossing into Gaza. They got about half a mile down the road, and then they turned around and came back. So we saw those trucks return. I spoke to somebody from the UN, quite a senior source, who told me nothing is going to get into Gaza today. And this was supposed to be the breakthrough. Now, what happened throughout the day, and this may well have had an impact, is there was a barrage of rockets from the Gaza Strip, most of them intercepted by the so-called Iron Dome rocket defense system, but some did fall. Now, in one of those attacks, 10 people were injured. 2 of those died of those injuries later. They were farm workers. Also, throughout the day, we heard 1 Israeli soldier had been injured in a fire just about, I don't know, 2 miles down that way. He was brought to an ambulance here, and the ambulance went into Israel. Now, then we heard a mortar attack happen at Kerem Abu Salem, where another Israeli soldier was injured. Whether that had an impact on the Israelis in opening that border, we don't know, but certainly all of this has made it much more difficult for the aid agencies to try and get that much-needed humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. Now, whether it happens tomorrow or not, we are not sure. Certainly there'll be conversations going on between the United Nations and the Israelis in hopefully getting that border open. But right now, no one's confident that that barrier will be open.
OK, Imran Khan there for us in southern Israel. Many thanks for that update. Well, let's get the latest in Gaza. The death toll from Israel's bombardment there keeps rising, and the humanitarian situation is only getting worse. Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 213 Palestinians so far. That includes 61 children. Thousands of people have been made homeless and are sheltering in schools. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned the military operation against Hamas in Gaza will continue.
Our enemies see what price we are charging for the aggression against us. I am sure they will learn the lesson. We will continue the operation in Gaza no matter how long it takes. We took on Hamas years back, and the enemies around us are learning their lessons of what we can do to them if they dare to attack us.
Well, we can go live to Gaza and speak to our correspondent, Al Jazeera's Safwat Al-Khallout. Safwat, you are, I believe, standing in front of the Ministry of Health. Bring us up to date with the very latest where you are.
Well, where I am, we could hear some explosions just a few seconds ago. The explosion sounded from the Israeli artillery who are stationing across the Israeli-Gaza borders. A few minutes ago, we also heard that one of the tank shells landed in one of the houses in Shijaiya neighborhood, which is to the east of Gaza City. Which this is the first Palestinian who died today, which another significant or indication that the level of fire is reduced in comparison with yesterday or the days before. We heard lots of talks about ceasefire, about intensive talks related to ceasefire or reaching an agreement. Islamic Jihad confirmed to us that they have been receiving tens of phone calls every day, including today, but in reality or on the ground, there is no ceasefire reached, or they said, Islamic Jihad, that the mediators are asking or talking about either mutual ceasefire or one-sided ceasefire. He said we have only one condition, or according to him, that Palestinian fighting groups have one condition, that Israel stop all the practices, all the aggression that they started in Jerusalem. Then he said we can talk about the ceasefire, and we are ready to cease the fire immediately if the Israelis apply or agree on this condition. Back to the RAMALLAH clinic, which is the only source for handling or dealing with COVID-19. This building has completely damaged, and to the left here we have the lab that have been making the COVID-19 test. Is also completely stopped. Anyway, COVID-19 becomes part of the past, as the doctor said, because all the measures, all the preventative measures or the protocol of COVID-19 has completely destroyed since thousands of Palestinians have been evacuating their homes and had to stay in the United Nations schools for sheltering. And on the other hand, since also many other people or hundreds of families, they have also to leave their buildings after the Israelis destroy them, and they move towards or for living with their relatives or with their friends. So the COVID-19, according to the doctors here, focus or concentrates on keeping distance as first preventative measure. But in these cases, in this war or escalation, the main principles have been completely damaged and destroyed. So no COVID-19 protocol is implemented. People without masks. We could see in the schools, tens of people in one room, staying in one room, families staying in one room, using all mattresses as urgent alternative. And of course, the hospitals in Gaza, they have been receiving lots of injuries, which forced the Ministry of Health to use the special departments that they use for COVID-19 to receive and treat the injuries.
And Safwat, I understand that many of many of the roads, much of the infrastructure has been destroyed. People can't even actually make their way to some of the hospitals. Is that your understanding of the situation, that people can't even get the help that they need, the medical help that they need, because of the roads?
Well, the health system has been collapsing for a long time, and the recent escalation even made it worse. So before the escalation, the people who used to go to the hospital, they used to buy the medicine from outside. So whenever anyone, which became like something usual and well known in Gaza, that if you go to the hospital, they give you the prescription and you buy the medicine from outside because of the serious shortages of the medical supplies in Gaza hospitals. On the other hand, the infrastructure, either electricity, either water, either the main roads have been, some of them completely destroyed and some are partially damaged. It's difficult to reach hospitals, not because only the roads are damaged, but because of the fear of moving from a place to another. And sometimes you have the situation is quiet, and suddenly you have tens of airstrikes bombing all over the Gaza Strip. So there is fear. There is shortages in the hospitals, and of course, reaching the hospitals is something also difficult because either the roads are destroyed, and also the ambulances spend most of the time patrolling and rushing towards the destroyed or the bombarded areas to carry injuries or casualties from the destroyed places.
I've also been hearing that there is a real urgency when it comes to lack of water, and sanitation is now also a problem because many of the pipes have been destroyed, and that there's sewage now going onto the streets. So you talk about the threat of COVID and the injuries people are facing, but once you don't even have the basics like sanitation, that can only breed things like disease. I mean, the situation is really dire, isn't it?
I spoke to the mayor of Gaza and I had a long chat about what they can do and what is Gaza expecting. He said that Gaza, the municipality of Gaza, is running out of fuel and they don't have the necessary equipments for dealing the solid waste. He said they have only few days and few hundreds or thousands of liters for using of fuel for using or for moving their heavy-duty machines that they use for carrying and cleaning up the streets. The sewage is also another essential problem here, important problem, since the network, the sewage network, has in many places it has been destroyed, and in some other places has also damaged. He told me that they have no choice but to push or to pump the raw sewage into the sea, which will cause environmental problems or environmental pollution. So from one hand, they don't have enough capability or enough abilities, enough machines, enough fuel to continue introducing the sanitation services, collecting the garbage, and even dropping it, because the garbage that they collect, they have a place that are like a certain place near the borders where they push or drop all these solid waste near, so which is now quite difficult to reach, or that needs a very special coordination with the Israeli army through the international organization. So yes, Gaza is from the health perspective, from the infection, he said that they are expecting environmental problem. They are expecting that these solid waste that they will not be able to gather and drop near the borders, that will cause lots of diseases.
Okay, many thanks for that. Safwat Al-Khalout, Al Jazeera's correspondent there in Gaza. Let's get a bit more on efforts being made outside of the region to bring about an end to this conflict. We've heard recently from the European Union foreign ministers. They've held an emergency video meeting on the situation in Israel and Palestine. The EU foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, is calling for an immediate ceasefire between the two sides.
We support the right of defense to Israel and the right to security, also for the Palestinians. And we consider that security for Israel and Palestine requires a true political solution, because only a true political solution could bring peace. And for doing that, we need to restore a political horizon. Now the priority, the urgency, is to stop violence and to implement a ceasefire.
Let's bring in MARWAN BISHARA, Al Jazeera's senior political analyst. He joins us live from Doha. MARWAN, so this call from European leaders coming after we heard from President Biden yesterday, also calling for a ceasefire after having a conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. Do you get a sense now that the pressure is on to bring about an end to this conflict, that something is going to happen?
No, I don't, actually. And I think we probably should be a bit more nuanced in the way we see what is happening. From the European, the effort is too little, too late. Too little, too late. And there's a great degree of cynicism in the way European leaders are calling the Israeli prime ministers and congratulating him on the efforts being made, as they call it, in support of Israel's security, when everyone knows what is happening is Israel defending its occupation, not its national security. So there has been a certain degree of complicity between the European leaders and the Israeli government. As for the American president, I think, let's check it. I think what he did say is that he supports a ceasefire. He did not call or demand a ceasefire. He said he supports one. And who does he think will actually demand one when he himself and his administration have vetoed such a ceasefire proposal at the United Nations? So clearly the Europeans and the Americans are moving very, very slowly, giving Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli right the time to finish the job. And what is the job? Well, the job apparently is 5. 1, yes, to destroy the infrastructure of Hamas. But more importantly, to destroy the infrastructure, economic, financial, administrative, and municipal in Gaza. 3, to destroy the livelihood of so many Gazans so as to force them to turn against the rulers of Gaza, i.e. Hamas. And 4th, to satisfy the Israeli radical racist right. And 5th, to maintain his own political future and to stay in power. These are not goals that the European Union should share with Israel. These are not goals that the American administration should share with Israel. Unfortunately, there's a great degree of cynicism on part of the Europeans and the American governments, a cynicism that is meeting a certain degree of sadism on the part of Netanyahu and his government.
Marwan, let me pick you up on that point you made about the United Nations, because as you said, they met on Sunday. The United Nations Security Council met virtually on Sunday. And so far, the US has blocked at least 3 attempts by the UN Security Council to release some sort of joint statement on the situation in Gaza. But our understanding is they are once again holding discussions on the situation in Israel and Palestine. And we are expecting some sort of live event, some live statement from them again. What are your thoughts on the UNSC? Do you think they can do anything when it comes to this conflict between Palestine and Israel, or is it just talking heads, essentially?
Well, certainly they have failed the last 70 years. We lost count of how many times the General Assembly have passed resolutions about, say, the right of return. How many times have the UN Security Council passed resolutions about the occupied territories as under the 4th Geneva Convention, where international humanitarian law must be applied? So many resolutions have passed at the United Nations, and nothing happened. Israel simply did not respect them, and the United States protected it, and to some degree the Europeans. So what we have now, and this is a bit what puzzles me, what we have now is this incredible effort to come out with a statement. So what? I mean, so they come out with a statement, and then what? Why is a statement so important? I mean, it is important symbolically, but how is it important functionally? How will it be applicable? How will it be enforced? Who will enforce it? Who will use a certain leverage on the Israelis and, say, the Palestinians to stop? We're back to square one. So I think, although we're talking a lot about them agreeing on a statement, which probably will be watered down so much that probably the Israeli government will be laughing it out to Gaza. And yet, you know, we say, good, let them have a statement. Why not? But I don't think we should I don't think we should depend on the investment so much while Gaza bleeds, while the war escalates, while the infrastructure, the water, the electricity, the economic life of millions of people are getting destroyed.
Marwan, who actually has the leverage to actually bring about an end to the current conflict that we're seeing in Palestine and Israel? Is it just the United States?
Well, the United States is the one that has supported Israel with over $200 billion. If anyone knows anything about the history of financial aid, well, in terms of just dollar figures, this is 4 times more than the United States gave to the Europeans in the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. This is how much the United States gave Israel in terms of military and financial aid. The United States is Israel's patron. It's the defender of Israel in the international arena. It's the supporter of Israel in terms of economics, in terms of technology, in terms of armament, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of strategically and every other way. And Israel owes the United States for all these services rendered, for the protection it provides Israel. Because without the United States, Israel would not be able not only to maintain its national security, but certainly it won't be able to maintain its occupation. It wouldn't have been the formidable force it is today, economic or strategic. So certainly the United States has the capacity. When there's will, there's a way, as they say. But clearly there isn't a will on the part of this administration, like most other previous administration, to exercise that leverage against Israel. When it comes to the Europeans, they have important economic and diplomatic relations with Israel. They also have some leverage, less than the Americans, but they certainly have some leverage. Together, the Europeans and the Americans could, in fact, discipline Israel for its own sake, for the sake of Israeli security, for the sake of the security of Israelis. They could discipline the Netanyahu government. Because as I said earlier, 2 of the most important objectives of this horrible war are cynical calculations on the part of Netanyahu and his clique to stay in power. This is not in the best interest of the United States or the European Union, and certainly not in the best interest of peace and security in the region.
What do you think, Marwan, is Israel's game plan here? What do you think it wants the country to look like 10 or 20 years from now?
I tell you, one of the things that you played just earlier, a few minutes ago, that clip from Netanyahu, I find it probably one of the few very disturbing things I've heard throughout this conflict. When he said, and I think I'm paraphrasing, I'm not exactly quoting, but I'm paraphrasing, I think, accurately. He said, we are doing what we're doing in Gaza, the way we're doing it, so that everyone else in the region will learn what we will be able to do to them if they dare do what Hamas did in Gaza, what the Palestinians are doing. That's a very, very dangerous statement. The arrogance here really breeds a whole lot of stupidity. How could someone be saying that I am making millions of Palestinians pay the price because I want to deter others in the region? The Palestinians are not some kind of a game that he toys with. Their lives and livelihoods and their loved ones and their economy and so on and so forth are not something for him to bargain and to play with in order to make some strategic lesson to some, I don't know who, neighbors, what, Iran, Hezbollah, I'm not sure. But the fact that he says that he is doing what he's doing in Gaza, that he's continuing with the war in Gaza for the 5 reasons I just mentioned earlier. And he says that we need to do this and we need to continue with this, meaning Palestinians need to continue to pay the price. The civilians need to continue the price so that others learn the lesson. That's a terrible thing to say, especially when we are talking about people under occupation. We keep repeating that, but that's indispensable context because we are not talking about two separate countries. This is not an interstate conflict. This is a conflict between occupied and occupier. The occupier owes the occupied the right to defend them, the necessity, the responsibility to defend them. Instead, they are using F-15s and F-35s. They're using cannons and drones to bomb them. To do what? For what? What's the objective? To teach a lesson?
So, Marwan, the way you describe it, I mean, we've seen the pictures. Many people are seeing the pictures live on air. Why do you feel that the international community, including the US, don't seem to have that willingness to go beyond words? Why isn't more being done? Why aren't sanctions being put on Israel? What is the political climate behind that?
Look, this is a very good question. And unfortunately, the answer is, for me anyway, it's not very convincing. But I think generally speaking, global powers, let's say the 5 members of the UN Security Council, they speak, they talk the big talk, but they don't really mean it. The United States says something, this administration has said a lot about putting democracy and human rights at the center of foreign policy.
Marwan, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you because, as I mentioned a little earlier, we were expecting to hear from the UN Security Council, who have been holding discussions on that situation in Israel and Palestine. Let's have a listen in. I believe we can see Palestine's UN ambassador there giving a press briefing.
The inhabitants of Jerusalem, in particular in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, were forcibly evicted from their homes while the international community remained deaf and silent to the outcry of the Palestinian people. The Arab group and before that, the Arab ministers condemned the brutal attacks on Gaza and the systematic crimes against the Palestinians. We also condemned the violation of the sanctity of the religious holy sites and the evictions of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem. In a time when we are promoting multilateralism, we firmly believe in the crucial role of the United Nations system in its entirety. It cannot nor should remain silent in the face of oppression and passively condone bloodshed. So the Arab group, in accordance with the decision 8660 of the Council of Arab Ministers of Foreign Affairs, held on May 11th, engage in a consultation with the Secretary General, the Security Council, and the President of the General Assembly to explore all ways to put an end to the escalation of violence. In this regard, the Troika of the Arab group, in the absence of the Secretary General of the United Nations, who was abroad from New York, met the chef de cabinet of the Secretary General to support the personal engagement of the Secretary General in the efforts to de-escalate the current violence sequence. We welcome the personal commitment of the Secretary General and his continued action, and ask him to intensify his contacts with all the world's leaders to put an end to the repression that Palestinians are facing. The Arab group, in close consultation with the Arab non-members or member of the Security Council, Tunisia, met also with the chair of the Security Council and officially requested to hold an urgent open meeting of the Security Council, which took place, as you know, on May 16th. We also called upon the Security Council, the Quartet of the Middle East, and the Secretary General of the United Nations to resolutely commit to end this situation and to relaunch the peace process to find a just and lasting solution to the conflict that would establish a sovereign Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital in accordance with the relevant United Nations resolutions. While the Security Council continues its deliberation regarding this urgent matter, we sincerely hope that it would put aside narrow agendas and live up to its responsibility to protect human lives. However, in light of the grave situation, and given the fact that the Security Council was until now not able to react or to adopt an outcome document and formulate a consensual position regarding the repression facing the Palestinians in the occupied territories, the Arab group decided to call for an urgent meeting of the General Assembly. Accordingly, and in my capacity as chair of the Arab group, I jointly delivered with my brother Abdou Bari, ambassador of Niger and chair of the OIC group, a letter to the President of the General Assembly calling for a meeting of the General Assembly to discuss the latest developments in Palestine and the atrocities Palestinians are facing. This letter has been circulated to all member states, informing them of the convening on Thursday, 20th May, of a meeting of the General Assembly to discuss the situation in Palestine. I cannot fail the opportunity to express my gratitude to the President of the General Assembly for his swift reaction and constant availability. The United Nations as a whole must raise its voice and contribute effectively to the achievement of a ceasefire. Hence, the request for a meeting of the General Assembly, which aimed to support the work of the Security Council by garnering all efforts to recover the stability beforehand and mobilizing all the actors to launch a political process without any delay. In this vein, member states have the legitimate right to express their position through this universal and democratic forum that is the General Assembly, and thus contributing to putting an end to this escalation of violence and atrocities Palestinian people are facing. The resolution to the Palestinian issues require addressing the root causes of the problem, occupation, enabling the Palestinian people to exercise their inalienable rights to have their independent states within the 1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as capital is the only acceptable solution and the unique way to bring a real and sustainable peace to the region. And I thank you. Now give the floor to my brother Riyad to add some element.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am happy to see many friends face to face. I want to begin by expressing our gratitude to the Arab group, to the OIC group, and yesterday to the NAM group, who have joined in calling for the meeting of the General Assembly, which will take place on Thursday. My understanding that there will be a large number of ministers attending that meeting, and we appreciate the fact that there will be a massive solidarity expressed to the Palestinian people, as it was expressed in the last meeting of the Security Council, in which about 10 ministers, including the Secretary General, attended that meeting. For us, the immediate thing that we need is a political will to stop this aggression against our people. This current aggression by Israel, the occupying power against our people, started at the beginning of Ramadan, when they exhibited, the Israeli occupying authority, along with extremist, racist, terrorist Jewish groups who were chanting in front of Bab al-Amud, Damascus Gate, burn the Arabs, death to the Arabs, denying our people of their religious right to pray during the holy month of Ramadan in Al-Aqsa Mosque and Al-Haram al-Sharif. These confrontations from the occupiers in the holy sites and the threats to expel people from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan accelerated the situation, and our people heroically, peacefully, in these locations in occupied East Jerusalem, resisted these fascist activities by the Israeli occupying authorities. That followed about 8 or 9 days ago by massive military aggression against our people in the Gaza Strip, in which, up to now, and one can count, 213 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip were killed, among them 61 children, 36 women, 16 elders, and about 1,500 injured. And you add to that more than 30 Palestinians in Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank were killed, and about 4,000 injured. 7,000 buildings in the Gaza Strip either damaged or destroyed, including a number of high-rise buildings, one of them also hosting many of your colleagues, journalists. These crimes against our people require from the international community a resolve to stop this aggression against our people. Put yourself in the shoe of the Palestinian people. If your country is occupied, if your land is confiscated, if settlements illegally being constructed, if people living in their homes, such as Sheikh Jarrah, being, threatened to be expelled from their homes. 2 million are being put in an open space jail on the Gaza Strip for 14 years, denying them freedom of access and movement. Put yourself in the shoe of about 2 million Palestinians who are citizens of the State of Israel, being treated as second and third-class citizens for a long period of time, and putting about 1,000 of them during the course of the last 8-9 days in prison, lynching some of them, as you have witnessed in Al-Lud, then what should the Palestinian people do? Often you hear some saying Israel has the right to defend itself. What rights do we have? Do we have the right to resist occupation? Do we have the right to protect our children before they go to sleep? Do we have the right to stop the illegal settlement activities and annexation? Do we have the right to express our opinion and to demonstrate peacefully in the street? Do we have the right to go to Al-Aqsa Mosque and to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and exercise our freedom of religion without oppression? So those who lecture to us about human rights, then look at what is happening to the vulnerable Palestinian people who are saying enough is enough. 53 years of occupation with this kind of ruthless apartheid occupation against our people, and 73 years since the Nakba, in which our people who are citizens of the State of Israel, instead of acquiring their national rights and living in freedom and dignity there in their ancestral homeland, look at the Israeli media. They're accusing them for what they are doing to resist this onslaught against the Palestinian people. So enough is enough. And I can tell you, although the immediate responsibility of the international community is to bring a ceasefire immediately, the second, responsibility, or what we want humanitarian assistance from all those who can to help our people in the Gaza Strip, to provide them with protection. About 50,000 of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are now moving into 43 schools of UNRWA, seeking international protection under the flag of the United Nations. Those people, they need to be fed, they need to have medical services, they need blankets, they need all the necessary things, including water and what have you, and protection during this time of the man-made catastrophe. And I was in a meeting before coming here in which Madame Di Carlo was representing the SG in that meeting. I asked her, and I asked the spokesperson of the SG who left you a few minutes ago, that it is the responsibility of the SG to issue an emergency call for humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip immediately. He cannot continue to delay this process. UNRWA is welcoming all those who are seeking protection and afraid for their lives and their children in these schools. But, they need to be provided with assistance, including, money assistance to hire more Palestinians to come and help in this undertaking of taking care of tens of thousands who are seeking protections in these schools. This is what we are talking about. The Security Council is shameful act of not even expressing a unified position calling for the end of this aggression. The quartet issued a statement early in the ball game, a simple statement, which in spite of the fact that it did not reflect what we wanted, but we welcomed, they spoke. All countries spoke. The Arabs convened an emergency meeting at the level of ministers. The OIC convened a ministerial committee just recently. The NAM agreed yesterday to convene an emergency ministerial meeting for the Palestine Ministerial Committee of NAM. The Europeans issued their position and their statement. Everyone is saying something, and the institution that is responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security met 3 times in emergency sessions, and it was not allowed to utter a position calling for a ceasefire and to stop this aggression against the Palestinian people, because one country did not allow the Security Council to do so. So we will tell you, after this aggression stops, business as usual cannot be prevailing in our region. To tell us, be quiet, let's fix the Gaza Strip, let us engage in talks and what have you, that will not elevate itself to what is needed. What is needed, as was demonstrated by the Palestinian people in both sides of the green light and in every corner of the globe, including in New York, in Chicago, in Washington, in Sydney, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in the refugee camps, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, everywhere, that we cannot continue to live under this oppressive apartheid regime, that what should happen, this occupation has to end, and we need to have the independence of our state with East Jerusalem as its capital, where we can live with dignity and freedom, and to begin the process also of addressing all other issues facing the entire nation of the Palestinian people. This is what I wanted to share with you at this time. And again, I thank my colleagues representing this massive group of countries, and we are grateful for this unity among all these countries that are outraged of what is really happening to the Palestinian people, demonstrating their solidarity and doing everything possible in order to bring an end to this aggression against our people.